Great.
Okay, we've arrived. Welcome everyone to week 4, seminar on perversion. And just to keep it nice and perverse, we're going to begin today by discussing not seminar 4, but seminar 8. So things have taken a turn for perversion indeed. Now, seminar 8, of course, is the Transference seminar of Lacan's. And this was translated by Bruce Fink, came out also a few years ago, maybe from memory, four or five, something like that. And in it, he makes some of his rare comments about Nietzsche. He hardly ever mentions Nietzsche, which is surprising to some, including especially me, especially as a young pup, given all the proximities between Nietzsche and Freud, Nietzsche and psychoanalysis, therefore. So when you do get Lacan mentioning Nietzsche, it's a rare treat, and it's good to pay attention, especially if it's an intelligent point. So let's have a look at what he says. It is nevertheless indisputable, and Nietzsche put his finger on it, on Socrates' profound incompetence every time he broaches the topic of tragedy. Socrates' profound incompetence whenever Socrates touches the topic of tragedy. He went to his head. This is Nietzsche back, right? He went to his head making this discovery. His first work, The Birth of Tragedy, grew out of it, as did all his subsequent work. There it is, The Birth of Tragedy. His firstborn work, 1872. Down the bottom there you see the Case of Wagner, which is one of Nietzsche's final works in 1888. And Walter Kaufmann, one of the original, probably the founding translator of Nietzsche's corpus, decided to put the beginning and the end for us there. And it's a nice one to cut your teeth on, even though Kaufmann overdoes the footnotes sometimes. Now, henceforth, I'm going to follow a reading that's in your advanced readings box. That's the Bataille and the Erotics of the Real paper from around about page 316. And this is an early version of chapter 1 of the 2021 book, Eroticizing Aesthetics in the Real with Bataille and Lacan. Some have expressed that the hardcover is pricing them out at the moment. But what I put in your advanced readings Lacan Google Drive is early article versions of some of the key chapters. So you'll still be able to get access to at least some of the key thoughts. So where are we? Socrates' profound incompetence every time he broaches the topic of tragedy. He went to Nietzsche's head making this discovery in 1872, almost ostracized him from the rest of his classical profession. Now, note well, Lacan and Nietzsche both have great praise for the Greek tragic festival for the depths of its meaning-making wisdom, which enables both mindfulness and vicarious release for the drives. Now, sounds good. However, by contrast, Lacan in the Transference seminar cites Plato's Gorgias 502 BD, where, Lacan says, tragedy is touched on by Plato, only to be abruptly executed in 3 lines among the arts of flattery as one rhetoric among the others, as if there is nothing more to be said. So we have here at the, right near the beginning of the tradition, of the Western tradition, but, on the downside of the peak, either Plato or Socrates or both completely disagreeing with Lacan and Nietzsche. How dare they, right? Obviously, they didn't know who Lacan and Nietzsche are, but we do, and it's striking to see how different their opinions are. What does Plato and Socrates say in the Gorgias? Tragedy aims merely to gratify the citizens, to neglect the common good for their personal interest, and thereby treat them like children, whether this makes them better or makes them worse. But Lacan's ethics seminar, now seminar 7, the one before the Transference seminar, disagrees. All right, what does he say? When the hero trembles before nothing in a tragic play, crossing not only all fear but all pity, it shows us where the pole of desire is. So the subject learns a little bit more about the deepest level. So unlike Plato and Socrates, Lacan, along with Nietzsche, are finding great value in Greek tragedy and suggesting that there's some profound incompetence going on in Plato and Socrates on this topic, which is strange because, you know, they're the two great philosophers at the founding of the Western tradition. That's what we're taught, and rightly so, because of the influence they've had. It was, I think, Alfred North Whitehead who said philosophy since Plato is a series of footnotes to Plato, just because of the founding influence he's had on the Western tradition. From Plato to Nietzsche, you get a lot of homogeneity, often a series of footnotes. Now, what's Bataille going to say about this, right? Because Plato has made the claim that tragedy neglects the good, neglects the common good. What might Bataille say? It's actually good to periodically take a break from certain notions of the common good. There's time for taboos, profane time, but there's also time for transgression, which historically was sacred time. And he gets this profane sacred distinction from Émile Durkheim, the founder of the French School of Sociology. His famous nephew, Marcel Mauss, was the kind of next cab off the rank, and they greatly influenced the 1930s College of Sociology. Bataille and co., with Levi-Strauss probably being the final big name in this kind of genealogy, or in this legacy, this sociological legacy. And Freud in his totem and taboo work is actually citing from these figures as well to work out, you know, what's going on in, you know, primitive archaic times and totemism, and apologizing that he's not an expert sociologist. He's using the scholarship of those who are and trying to draw from it psychoanalytically and apply psychoanalysis to it. So what does Bataille himself say about tragedy? Classical tragedy is most engaging when the character of the hero leads to destruction, to look it straight in the face. So there's something similar to what Lacan's saying there, right? By going straight towards destruction, to look it straight in the face, we're learning something a little bit more about desire, about the pole of desire. And here, eroticism is analogous to a tragedy, says Bataille, as normal taboos are transgressed at the price of a sacrifice. So this sort of sacred time transgression is not something you might do in your ordinary workaday life. It's something you might not want to do at all in your life. It's something to vicariously reenact in a way through the tragic works of art, right? But this is going to get lost if somebody comes along with profound competence and sees it all as just a mere art of flattery that distracts us from the common good, which we're supposed to already know what it is with great certainty. What's Freud say? So it's good to get back to Freud when doing these sorts of comparisons. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, we do not spare the spectators the most painful experiences in tragedy that can yet be felt by them as highly enjoyable. How? Through an instinct of mastery, where remembering, repeating, and working through the tragic wheel is to empower and become a master of the situation. So that's Freud sort of speculating on why do horror themes like parricide or matricide, or what's the one when you kill your kids? I forgot what it is. Infantilicide, probably something like that, or enucleation, or even incest itself. How is that an object of enjoyment and pleasure, right? This is what, we might think. How was it for our good? This is what Plato and Socrates thought. But just by looking at what Freud, Bataille, Lacan are saying here, I think we know exactly why, right? It's a remembering, it's a repeating, it's a working through, it's an instinct of mastery so we can learn about the pole of desire, right? But also get maybe some vicarious release for our drives, because we do have the desire or the drive to do these like transgressive things, which we don't generally because of the consequences. Doesn't mean the drive or the desire isn't there. What does Nietzsche say? He's talking about tragedy, the joy in destruction, in the sacrifice of its highest types. This is a cathartic display of fearlessness in the face of the fearsome and the questionable, such that pleasure in tragedy characterizes strong ages and natures. So there he's talking about classical Greece between 600 and 400 BC, not so much the Greece that comes after, which is when Plato starts becoming the dominant paradigm, sometimes known as the Hellenistic era, Aristotle quickly to follow, and that's the great genealogy in a way. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle briefly tutored Alexander the Great, but not necessarily responsible for everything Alexander did and didn't do, of course. It wasn't a lifetime appointment. Now, so this is what Lacan's talking about now in Seminar 8. With Socrates' 5th century intervention into tragedy, right, thanks to Plato's subsequent 4th century writings of his teacher, our experience of this artistic religious practice begins to wane as we enter what Lacan calls the longest transference, given this expression its fullest import that history has ever known. So why is Lacan in his Transference seminar calling the transference to Socrates the longest transference that history has ever known? What is transference in Lacan? In Seminar 11, he famously defines it as the subject who is supposed to know. So transference is a kind of belief state projected onto an analyst as the one supposed to know. As such, with Plato's Socratic transference, with Socrates being the one supposed to know for Plato, the profound incompetence between the two of them, what Bataille calls literature's ecstatic representations of tragic loss, was later adopted by Christendom, so that when it came to tragedy and myth, he didn't know, which is how Lacan characterizes we modern subjects, for neither do we know, as his transference eventually becomes our own. So our transference or belief state combines Socrates' profound incompetence on tragedy, which we've just been discussing, to Yahweh's ferocious ignorance on sexual knowledge and mythopoetic rituals of it, as we discussed last week. So they're become the two central poles of Western civilization, Western metaphysics, right? We're not very good with art. We're not very good with religion, or something has been lost when we combine these two traditions, Christian-Platonism, right, brought together under some kind of god of the good. And this is where psychoanalysis and some fellow travelers have to come in and pick up the detritus and find out what went wrong. Why is the most powerful tradition also seemingly hell-bent on destroying the planet as a place inhabitable for humankind, for example? Or why does it insist on all the economic inequality and depravity? Why does it insist on being so warlike? Why does it have such, duplicitous attempts at democracy everywhere? Why does it prop up dictatorships? Why are all the bad things so acute when we're supposed to be the most advanced part of the species? There are reasons for that, and this is what we're eventually going to come to when it comes to the idea that morality itself can count as perversion. We're not going around saying, I'm going to go out and do something perverse and corrupt and depraved today. We always think we're doing the good, but many times we are not. And that's how the perverse trait of the drive gets incorporated into morality. And maybe there was something here at the beginning of the Western tradition where things went awry. You look at the change involved when, as Nietzsche puts it in The Birth of Tragedy, which is a sort of classical Hellenic position, only as an aesthetic phenomenon are existence and the world justified. Which is not how we tend to see today. We see only as a moral phenomenon. Is it justified? But yet we get caught up in perversion most of all because of this profound incompetence and ferocious ignorance that's been passed down the line. Now, let's have a look at what Lacan says. This is in Seminar 7, the Ethics Seminar. I forgot to write it on the slide there, but it's here on the recording. It is not our intention, says Lacan, to engage in exoticism here, but that is what is involved. Now, some of you might know that exoticism in art history means looking at foreign cultures or other cultures and fantasizing about how, wondrous they are, which is sometimes our own projections. But that is what is involved. And you've got to have a look at what the literal meaning of exoticism is too. The word exotic is rooted in the Greek word exo, outside. It means literally from outside. In other words, going back to Lacan, this whole sphere, right, this whole sphere of the gods, of the myths, of these tragic rituals that reenacted them in a sublimated form, as a form of art on the stage, this whole sphere is only really accessible to us from the outside, from the point of view of science and of objectification. For us Christians who have been educated by Christianity, we have erased the whole sphere of the gods. And we are, in fact, interested here in that which we have replaced it with, as illuminated by psychoanalysis. It is something I have called the phenomenon of the beautiful, something I've begun to define as the limit of the second death. Sartre tells us that there is something else, that a form of transgression is possible, and he calls it crime. So we're going to have a look at Sartre, especially after the break, and through the work of Danny Nobis, looking very closely at Lacan's Kant of Exile paper. And there's also a number of very interesting passages on Sartre in Lacan's ethics seminar, this being just one example of them. And when we think about crime, we think about a really degraded form of transgression, transgression condemned, transgression that has no outlet, no access to the sacred, it's not sublimated. It's this paternally repressed, as a monster, as some kind of revenge wanting to be waged. The perversity of it has dammed up and built up and turned on itself and become ferocious because there's no proper outlet, or sacred outlet like there used to be. Even in Christianity, they have a notion of sin. You might think that transgression means sin, but Bataille says no. Sin is transgression condemned under Christendom. So it still has that sort of degrading character. You're not allowed to go around and purposefully commit sin. People do, and they have to confess, because it's impossible to live with the purity of a Jesus, especially when there's work to do, empire to do, war to do, and also the dealing with the actual libido, which is not always so easily restricted under monogamy, procreative form of sex, heterosexual sex, for the purpose of children. It's mission impossible. Right. So this is what's been put there instead of the gods. And in between, we have this phenomenon of the beautiful, where we can't really get away from beauty. No one can really do without beauty, even though it's useless. As Freud says in Civilization, in its discontents, beauty is useless, but nowhere can anyone do without it. So it's a sort of like a useful uselessness, or a needed uselessness. And that's because going back to the initial paradox, it's good to take a good from the good sometimes, because the drives cannot easily be subordinated all into a specific notion of the good, especially if we think we're going to improve our ability to do this by cleansing the gods of the drive, of the body, of nature, and then cleansing our art as well. So religion and aesthetics become denaturalized, all subordinated towards the good. And what happens instead? The perversion magnifies. And that's the history of where we went wrong, if you like. Now, let's come back at this in a few different ways. Going back to Lacan's Transference seminar. Those of you who have read it, who've read the Transference seminar, know it's not a whole extended seminar on Greek tragedy. You get that in Seminar 7 in that whole major part on Antigone, the famous treatment of Antigone. This one instead is a famous treatment of one of the founding texts of the Western philosophical tradition. Sorry if you can't hear me because I'm blocking the mic. The Symposium. This is the Loeb edition, which of course the classical scholars among you will know give you the well-translated English on one side and the classical Greek on the other side. There's also a website up online called the Perseus website, run out of one of the North American universities, Tufts, I think it is, which has a lot of this work automated, including linked to the Little and Scott Greek and English dictionary. So if you want to know, geez, what Greek word did he use for eros or for the good? You just double click it, it goes to the dictionary and actually tells you it was agathon. Now you know, right? Or maybe it wasn't, maybe it was something else. Maybe it's of no consequence, maybe it is. But if you're reading Lacan, you know he's gonna go polylingual on you when it comes to looking at the signifiers. So these are very useful tools to have at your fingertips. So what's going on in Plato's Symposium? Even though there's maybe some profound incompetences going on in there, it's still a real treasure to have a founding text of the Western philosophical tradition totally devoted to the topic of love. It's the book about love. The topic of discussion at this symposium is love. What is love? Socrates claims to know best of all. He claims to know nothing else. Everything else he says that I say is as disputable as a dream, but I do know love, right? And love being eros. And some of you might know there's a famous reference to the symposium as well in Freud's work, which I didn't get a chance to double check today, but I believe it's in 3 essays. Didn't get time to check whether it was a later edition or not, but he says that our notion of libido, it's not just pure sex. It's quite connected to the notion of eros you get, for example, in Plato's Symposium. It's a wider notion of love. It's a wider notion of sex. It's sex and its expansions, if you like, in its other dimensions, its sublimated dimension, its inflated dimensions, right? So what happens in this famous philosophical text? Socrates preaches on eros, cleanse the flesh. All right, so this is where you see the turning point coming in the tradition. It inflates this ladder of love up towards the good, but, says Lacan, it is met with the return of a drunken Alcibiades, as Lacan will say. Socrates' pupil and handsome beloved, that's him on the right, to raise this inflated dualism of Socrates to the ground. Lacan says, this is 7 or 8, page 66. This is for Lacan, the return of a drunken Alcibiades, who is Socrates' pupil, but also a famous Athenian general. It's for Lacan, the eruption or upheaval of the real, which, despite all the fine stories, as fascinating as they may seem, about an ultra world or mirage in the supernatural beyond, suffices to bring us back to reality, the real. So there is Alcibiades, and as Lacan takes pains to point out, he was like a kind of an it boy at the time. Like Lacan asked us to make some modern references for him, which is, modern in 1961. He goes, he's like a pre-Alexander, the Great, and Alexander the Great before Alexander. So you got to imagine a combination between JFK and Brigitte Bardot. Put them two together and you got Alcibiades. Like he's the main sex object of the time, but he's also right on the hands on the levers of politics of the most powerful center of power going around at the time. That's Alcibiades. And he's also a student of Socrates. Now, what does Alcibiades bring us back to, right? As it really is, the real. It's what was previously metaphorized by the Olympian deities, right? The gods that we've forgotten, right? Whom Lacan calls the real gods. It's page 161 of Seminar 8, the Transference Seminar. So please do look these up for yourself and try and, test your interpretation of what Lacan might mean. When you say to students like, oh yeah, Lacan calls, Zeus and Hera and Apollo and Dionysus the real gods. They're like, what? Does the great psychoanalyst really think that these like supermen and women were flying through the air, living on top of a mountain? And it's like, well, I don't think so, but why don't you look up and find out what he does mean, right? He means that these are metaphorizations of the real, or externalized projections of the real that magnify, in some ways, what we are, right? Our fantasies, our drives, our desires, where the gods belong to the field of the real. So this is now, I've jumped across to Seminar 11, page 45. So do check that one too, right? As staged in the Apollo Dionysus dynamic. So the Apollo Dionysus dynamic is the idea that you've got the rawness of the drive, in excess represented by Dionysus. Then you've got the Apollonian veil put over the top of it to shape it, to prettify it, to make it bearable. Beauty and the real, if you like. Beauty is the lure for us to face the real without getting too far into it, getting too gross or abject. But also beauty has to stay more to it, or else it becomes a mere phantom. right? Which is what happened with the Platonic whitewash. That meant the real could only return in the banal dialectic between neurosis and perversion. Like the Socrates, this is my thesis, like the Socrates and Alcibiades show of Symposium, akin to what Nietzsche at Athens' Decline in The Will to Power, section 427, calls two decadent movements running side by side. So Alcibiades is like this flashy, loving show, perverse, creating all this attention as being like too off the rails. While Socrates is almost like this proto-church father, like no, like stay away from materialism and desire and the drives, don't go too close. So neurosis and perversion, the beginning of this kind of almost dialectic that we have today, which again is another kind of a degeneration of a more optimal taboo and transgression relation, a relation between taboo, profane time, transgression, sacred time, which was religion before this moment. So I'm looking here for a kind of philosophical neutrality that looks at the root cause between how taboo and transgression ended up as neurosis versus perversion, rather than some kind of harmony. How did the Apollo-Dionysus dynamic end up as neurosis versus perversion? So we kind of look for what is the midpoint between these two positions as to kind of deepen our notion of analytic neutrality. Which, remember from the start of last week, Freud talking about the transference was saying we can't endorse someone's sensual current or their aesthetic current in advance without knowing what's involved. But you think optimally we want the subject to be some kind of midpoint between living a full life and a life of total abstinence, right? How do we get that sort of midpoint, and how do we get so bad at it, right? How do we see all these mangled sort of collapses in the clinic and in the criminal system and in politics? Now, what happens? Alcibiades becomes a barbarian Dionysus. This is Nietzsche's term, right? Repressed by Socrates instead of moderated by Apollo. So wild, always bent on destruction, which is why for Lacan, Socrates' demon, this is quoting Lacan's Seminar 8, 160, Socrates' demon or daemon is Alcibiades, embodying the elided elements of the real gods that appear in the guise of something that will cause a ruckus, such as theft, fraud, adultery, not to mention impiety. Also prostitution. There are stories of the gods where they trade in sexual services to get something they want. So Dionysus, once they get to the underworld in order to rescue Semele, he's been killed by Hera because the father of Semele was Zeus, philandering Zeus again. And so he has to promise to prostitute himself to someone to show him the way. So how can somebody be wholly against, for example, sex work in the ancient world when the gods themselves do it? Athena told the story of Athena promising something to Hephaestus to get something that she wanted, but then dodging it in the end, which led to another story. Right. And also homoeroticism. How could you be an abolitionist or trying to totally prohibit homoerotic acts when the gods and goddesses would exhibit them in their own stories? How could you be against the female sex or prejudiced against it when half the gods were feminine? Doesn't mean they were sort of Puritan ideals for us to copy. That's how we think, because we've grown up on the Christianity thinking we want someone to posit an ideal. But that's not what these myths do. What they do is magnify our drives. Just like when you go to an analytic session, you go there and you learn about your drives. You don't go there to copy the analyt's ego because he's got an ideal and here's the new Bible. No, you go there to learn about the real, right? It's better to know about it and then try and sublimate it with the know-how that we can get from psychoanalysis, which is not the same as a moral ideal. It's more of an ethics of psychoanalysis, right? But without an aesthetic outlet for the drives, right? When the profound incompetence of Socrates later combines with the ferocious ignorance of Yahweh coming through into Christianity, late Judaism, right? This ruckus worsens, right? This excessive kind of perverse behavior, which Bataille will decry as a consequence of the sovereignty of taboos at the most clear cut as absolute, trying to forbid the return of the real in any way, trying to reinforce the taboos and using religion to reinforce taboos rather than for having a space where we can take a guided break from taboos, right? Which only deepen the degree of sensual disturbance. says Bataille, by forbidding organized transgression. Now, organized transgression is not, Marquis de Sade going around doing the things he fantasizes about in his work, literally as gangs, right? That's not organized transgression. That's organized savagery. Organized transgression are those that you see by reading the tragic myths. When you read the tragic myths, they're also reading you, right? They're also saying something about the human condition. The festivals, when you got the great poets putting this stuff on the stage, where we like contemplate, interpret, even judge which poet did the best. And all the tragic poets, of course, were like reimagining and reinterpreting episodes from the history of Greek myth. And then there's the rituals themselves. The rituals themselves never stop. The tragic plays performed at the Festival of Dionysus were just one aspect of it. There would have been odes and processions and mysteries, all sorts of things going on to a certain extent too. All right, so you got the Platonic genealogy of that, and you got the Hebraic, from the Hellenic to the Hebraic genealogy of that. This is Seminar 17, page 136. Yahweh's ferocious ignorance towards religious practices founded on sexual knowledge, which blends supernatural agencies in with nature itself. So this is completely apparent when the later Roman Empire converted to Christianity, first through Emperor Constantine, who claimed to have this dream where he saw the signifier endutos nika, with this you shall conquer, and it was an image of the crucifix. So he told all his soldiers who were fighting a civil war, who gets to be the emperor, east and west side rivalry, scratch this onto your shield, and it's a sign of Jesus, and it should help us win. They happened to win. Constantine became a Christian. Christianity became decriminalized, which is good, right? You shouldn't absolutely criminalize a religion, but the reason why it was criminalized is because they refused to recognize other gods. No, ours is the only God. The rest of yours are fake, as if there's empirical evidence for any of the gods, right? So, but Constantine's successor Theodosius, unfortunately, went one step further. It wasn't just that Christianity was the religion of certain elites. It was law. To not be Christian or to be pagan, as they rebranded the previous divinities, was suddenly a crime. And then you got a lot of Holocaustal events, book burnings, to enforce this sort of dictatorship. And that's when the incompetence and the ignorance set themselves in. That's when things get a little dark, the dark ages. Now, let's cross-cut to Freud in 1908, his famous Civilized Sexual Morality and Modern Nervous Illness paper. Civilized here in scare quotes, as in how civilized is it really? Let me tell you what our so-called civilized sexual morality does. 1908, incidentally, was also when the year that Nietzsche's works were being read in the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, the Wednesday sessions, I think they were having. It's being read and actively discussed. And Freud shows his famous ambivalence. He likes it, but then he's like, no, like an accordion. But let's have a look at what he says anyway. He also condemns the inherited religious mores on our libidinal development, saying, the harmful suppression of the sexual life of civilized peoples or classes through the civilized sexual morality prevalent in them means that when libido did emerge, it was irreparably damaged, and many who would have been healthier being less good are falling now as victims to neurosis, as the well-behaved weaklings who later become lost to the great mass of people that tends to follow unwittingly. So this is Standard Edition 9, combining sections from page 185, 191 and 197. So please do check them out and meditate on these passages yourself. Now, compare that with what Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil, right? 1886. Yeah. He says, Christianity gave Eros, the libido, poison to drink. However, he did not die of it, but degenerated into a vice. right? So this is the idea that transgression, instead of being something as part of sacred time, becomes vice, sin, depravity, crime, right? That's what happens to a poisoned eros, right? And this was determined not only by the later Judaic priests who provided the soil for Christianity to grow, but also later Platonic Socrates' intervention. Okay, now into the original flourishing of Hellenismos. So the thing with Nietzsche is he says, like, when Plato and Socrates started moralizing, they were more Hebraic than they were Hellenic. There was something really foreign, like a drop of foreign blood on Hellenic soil, as Erwin Rohde puts it, right? Into this original flourishing of Hellenismos. What's Lacan say about this in the Transference seminar? Page 70. He calls this the fertile period of the 6th and 5th centuries, overflowing with intellectual creativity. We find ourselves at the historic climax of a particularly active era. All right, page 70. You have to check these out. Now, what Nietzsche says here, that here in our philosophical prime, it's not a coincidence that the symbols of sex are also venerable as such, right? The symbols of sex are also venerable. So he doesn't think this is a coincidence. If eros isn't poisoned, so is our capacity for sublimation into these intellectual heights. So it's not as if he's like calling for everyone to be, trying to live their life like a porn star, right? He's saying if we don't repress the libido, we have the opportunity to sublimate it. If we poison it, we have the opportunity for neurosis and perversion, for sin and transgression. So there's a subtle difference between moralism and the ethics of psychoanalysis going on here, right? And this also accords with Freud's idea, right, in relation, when he says that our relation to our libido, this is back in civilized sexual morality, lays down the pattern for our other modes of reacting to life, lays down the pattern. He restates this in his Leonardo da Vinci essay, 1910, 2 years later, where, excelling amidst the renaissance of antiquity's values, Leonardo's earlier repression of his sexual life does not favour its later sublimation. Such a pattern imposed, says Freud, meant Leonardo's activity and ability to form quick decisions began to fail, where a tendency towards deliberation and delay emerges, which is comparable to the regressions in neurotics. So Freud's trying to say, how come when we look at an exemplary case, the highest form of sublimation, right, total social valorization across history, why do we also see such like tremendously neurotic episodes in him? And he's saying because, there was earlier like repression imposed on his libido, which laid down the pattern, even though he's able to sublimate it and circumvent it and achieve the highest form of achievement there is, intellectual and creative. Still, when he's not on, he's not on. And like that earlier pattern still, causes regression sometimes, just as you see in ordinary neurotics. So there's hope for ordinary neurotics too. Even Leonardo has to go through it, right? It's because of what's happened in that early pattern, the way civilized sexual morality was imposed. What else does Freud say in the Leonardo essay? He talks about the sort of desexualization or the denaturalization of religion. This is Freud saying, so much of the divine and sacred was ultimately extracted from sexuality that the exhausted remnant fell into contempt. So what became sacred was defined as over against the bulk of our libidinal drives, to the point where, well, if what's sacred is this pure spirit, right, and that's the opposite of the libido, or what's left over of sexuality, which is most of it, then that leftover bit must be crap. So we start devaluating our libido excessively, right? Whereas originally, says Freud, genital worship was a sign of pride and hope, and the very connection between official religions and sexual activity, which Freud contrasts with our today, where many still feel the act required to propagate humankind, or they can in any case, is an offence to dignity that renders one degraded by the process, right? So that's a huge shift there. There's no genital worship in the Christian church, right? And a lot of other ones. Right, and Nietzsche says, such a pattern meant demonizing the prerequisite of life, which threw filth on the beginning, right? And he bemoans the concomitant loss of all the scientific methods of natural science in concert with mathematics and mechanics, the sense for facts, and the art of reading well, all of which had schools already centuries old, Nietzsche says, right? Replaced instead by the Hebraic art of holy lying, which already, Nietzsche adds, is not lacking in Plato. So something pre-existing in Plato enabled Pauline Christianity to come in and like put the pedal to the metal, find a more excessive form of it, which sits there in the margins until political elites decide to exploit it for political purposes. And next thing you know, we go from this, we've got the top here, the School of Athens by Raphael, the Renaissance, right? We go from that to a hole left by the Christian Dark Ages, right? Everyone's familiar with the exponential curves from our COVID times. Here's two to look at, right? The way scientific advancement was accumulating between the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans, right? Stops there, 1,000 years of Dark Ages, and then has to start up again, right? And imagine if we didn't have this like delay, how high it would be right now. Often this memes like, says things like, just think, if it wasn't for that hole, we could be exploring outer space together by now. Or just think, what happens when you get complacent about these forms of religion. So he's putting a little bit of a rocket up us, if you like, to say, this sort of move has consequences. As Freud puts it, a drive cannot be sublimated as long as it is repressed. So if we have a religion or a mythopoetic structure that just reinforces the repression and the denigration of libido, of the drives, we're not going to be able to sublimate it very well because we don't even want to admit we have it. Get it away from me, right? That's what happens. Now, let's fast forward now to a little bit of etymology with Lacan from Seminar 8 on the notion of agalma. Now, agalma, this is just an ordinary dictionary definition. It literally means statue, right? The agalma. It's a cult image or votive offering. But Lacan's going to see here a kind of like some kind of anticipation or presentation of object A, right? The fetish object. So this is Seminar 8 now. So we've been dealing with Seminar 4's notion of the fetish, which is mostly linked to the absent maternal phallus. And we're going to have we're having a little bit of a break from that today, which is nice. I want to see, every day castration, this castration, that gets a bit much. So let's have a look at object A in general, right? Or the fetish object in general, right? This is from Seminar 8. Lacan says, I'm going to do a phenomenology of fetishes, right? By Greek literature, where the word agama is used for multiple significations at the fringe of these uses, because, and he sort of says, look, I don't agree that there are root meanings for words. You've got to look at all the homophonies as well, right? So he looks at what does agama mean in all these fringe uses or side uses of parts of the word. He breaks apart the phoneme. It means I admire, I'm envious or jealous of, to bear with pain, to be indignant, the pupil of the eye, the sea that shines because perfectly still, the idea of sparkle. Also, Aglaia, the youngest of the three graces, which would be one of these qualities here, meaning shining or splendor. But it can also, if you take just the first three letters, agathos, it can also mean the good, right? Which of course is what Plato and Socrates are going to change the meaning of. They're going to change the notion of the good when they come in and intervene on this tradition. The shifting nature of the good, right? You can also see it in one of the figures, a real historical person, an actual poet in the symposium, the host of the symposium. His name actually is Agathon, which is a nice terminological coincidence. Agathon, the good, somebody his name is the good, right? Holds that love, when he gives his speech or what love is, he says, love is not the oldest, but the youngest God, which removed the various violences and strange doings among the gods to bring amity and peace once he began to rule them all, right? So this is in accordance with the sort of denaturalizing, desexualizing tradition that we get when Plato and Socrates come in. And every figure you look at, almost every one of their speeches, you can see a different form of this turning away from the real. We have a shift from eros, right? Libido, connected to the polymorphous perversity of the drives, which we can sublimate according to an ethics, if we're doing well, to agape, which is this sort of desexualized, denaturalized, Puritan, altruistic notion of love, the oblative notion of love that Lacan thinks object relations psychoanalysts are like regressing back to by preaching that, saying you're repressing the fundamental perversity of the drives. If you do that, or of desire. If you do that, we're not going to be able to sublimate it, and we get caught up in a moralizing hustle or a bluff whose dangers cannot be exaggerated. Now, let's have a look at Diotima's speech. She is the mystic woman that Socrates hands over to at one point, right? She says, first we see the love, first we've experienced love or eros for an individual body, right? Desire for its fleshy beauty. But then we recognize the beauty of other human bodies too, because it's not just one, right? Thus recognizing the property of beauty in general. So what is it that makes like that body, that body, that body, that body, that body, and all the rest? What makes it the same, makes all of those individual bodies seem beautiful? There must be a general form of beauty, of course, a general idea that they're resembling or participating in some way. Good, says Diotima, or Socrates via his intermediary. Now that you're starting to enter the realm of abstract qualities, right, which of course in Plato's theory of forms are more real than the real itself, we can continue our ascent away by noting higher kinds of abstract beauty, like the beautiful organizations, institutions, well-functioning law courts, well-functioning academies, right? Or the beauties of bodies of knowledge. Look at the science and scholarship around, poetry, or around the classical world, or around like physics or chemistry. Wow, there's a sort of beauty higher, more abstract, right? Further away from the body, right? That's the aim here. So in the end, we come to know the very essence of beauty in the beautiful itself, which is what makes life worthwhile to live. This is Socrates speaking by Diotima. For this essence is pure and unalloyed, not infected with the flesh and color of humanity or mortal trash. So you see his kind of almost neurotic prejudice creeping in there. It's virtuous, good, and what is more, the truth. And then you see sort of theological tendency. It's like, how do I make this construct take hold? I'll say it's also the truth, that it's not just something I constructed, it's something I discovered out there beyond the senses, beyond mere appearance. That's when you get the Platonic move. Now, this book on the right here, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony by Roberto Calasso, one of the best books on Greek myth I've ever read. Roberto recently passed away. I noticed some of my peers online were like, saying Vale Calasso, best books of Kafka I've ever read. So if you like Kafka, he's written a good book on Kafka as well. And I would add best book on Greek myth I've ever read too. And they're like, yep, that one's also like, much respected. So very knowledgeable, great man of letters from Florence. Now, how are we going for time? Okay, we've got a bit more time. I'll do a little bit more on Diotima and the Symposium. So before Socrates comes on, we have Agathon giving this speech, and he says, I'll tell you what love is. Love is a great God, and love is desire for beauty, right? Love, what does love want? What does desire desire? Desires beauty. And Socrates is going to come on and hand over to Diotima to show that this means that love or eros cannot be a god. Why not? Because for Socrates, to love is to desire what is lacked, making beauty something that eros or love lacks, right? So I think why Lacan likes some of these speeches is because you get here that the kind of deficit model of desire. Desire is based on lack, right? So, okay, so what? What's the problem? Well, if love is a god and it wants and it desires beauty, then that means beauty is something that the god doesn't have. So what are you saying, says Socrates? Are you saying that God is ugly? Why would a god desire beauty if it was already beautiful? So it must be ugly, right? Because desire is reduced to lack. And Agathon's like, oh, geez, I didn't think about it. So I didn't really think about it that way, right? And then Socrates goes further and says, but Agathon, you've also said that desire or love desires beautiful things that are also good. And Socrates is going, well, this means that love itself is not good, because if it desires good things, it must mean it's not good itself, because desire is lack. So you've just said that God is ugly and bad. So I'm going to come in and say that therefore love cannot be a god if that's what it does. And Agathons go, okay, let it be as you say, Socrates. You obviously you're the philosopher here. I'm just the cheerful host. And Socrates is going to keep this deficit model or install this deficit model of lack, deficit model of desire as lack, and also his sort of Puritan notion of God, and saying a God cannot have lack because he's transforming what it means to be a God in the Greek tradition, which is why he was eventually executed for corrupting the youth in impiety. And Nietzsche actually thought there's some truth to that, not that they should have executed him. He was still a legend, but the claim that he was, creating impiety is not altogether unjustified. All right. So this is when Socrates hangs over to Themi to say that love is not a god because gods can't lack. Right? They're already good and beautiful. That's why they're divine. And truth, by the way. Yep. So love has to be somewhere in between. And then Plato tells these myths by Socrates and Diotima that love is a daemon, which is in between the two, in between the bodily realm and in between the abstract realm, creating a journey so that we can ascend up the ladder of love like a stairway to heaven, right? Which might be fine and good, except what sort of tends to happen in this tradition, because of the valuing of the top to the exclusion of the bottom, is that once you get to the top, they kick the ladder out from beneath you, so you're stuck there. And because they call it truth, you're walking around in this bubble thinking you're up here. And what happens to the reality of our emotional erotic lives becomes maybe trampled on, an object of repression, right? So this is what's going on here. This is a wonderful drawing from William Blake of Jacob's Ladder. It's a good illustration of this trafficking here, this ascent. Now, what did William Blake himself think about this Christian-Platonic dualist turn, where the material realm down the bottom was only there to get us to the spiritual realm at the top, which was the good and the sacred and the God, and everything down the bottom was kind of like, something derisory, right? This is Blake talking about Christianity. As the caterpillar chooses the fairest leaves to lay her eggs on, so the priest lays his curse on the fairest joys. So he's saying something that basically could have come straight out of Nietzsche's Antichrist, that we've ended up cursing our animal side, our natural side, our bodily side, in order to float to the top in a way that's too excessive, right? We've cursed our fairest joys. And this is why Bataille loves William Blake. And in his Literature and Evil book, he has a whole chapter on William Blake. He says, Bataille, if I had to name those English writers who moved me most, that would be John Ford, Emily Bronte, and William Blake. There's also a nice chapter on Emily Bronte. In William Blake's life, the joy of the senses was a touchstone. Sensuality set him against the primacy of reason. He condemned the moral law in the name of sensuality, calling for sensual happiness, for exuberance of the body. One of William Blake's most famous little lines is, beauty is exuberance. What's the other way around? Exuberance is beauty. Yeah, so it's almost like, as a poet, William Blake, even though he's always metaphorizing through Judeo-Christian imagery, has kind of intuited that we've gone too far in the supersensory direction, right? We've cursed our fairest joys by doing that, by hypercathecting reason or hypercathecting moral law in a way that's ultimately repressive. Now, I've provided here's a quote from the Literature, Happiness and Evil article, which I've provided also in your advanced reading section of your LCA Dropbox, and that's an early version of chapter 4 of the 2021 book on Bataille and Lacan, eroticizing aesthetics in the rule of Bataille and Lacan. So that's something you can have a look at too, free of charge, if you want to think about these things a little bit more. Now, it's 2 minutes to, so maybe we'll take a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and close up some thoughts on this turning point that comes through Plato's Symposium, and then we'll throw open to some questions. Okay. Let's do a little bit more, and then we'll take some questions. Oh, here's some thoughts. Now, everyone can hear me? Yep, good. From ladder schemas to L schemas. I'm pretty impressed with how this one fell into place. Found a random diagram here of the ladder of love in Plato's Symposium. Happened to be going from the bottom left to the top right. I juxtaposed it with Lacan's famous L schema, and the bottom left to the top right happens to be the imaginary relation. And I thought, that's actually a pretty good fit. The wonders of surrealism in automatic writing. Why is that? Because here we are as an ego, Lacan's lambda schema, thinking we're going to climb towards this divine object, some fetish object, object A, the agalma, maybe linked to the sovereign good in some way. We think we're climbing up, right? Remember in Plato, it's you see a beautiful body, you notice other beautiful bodies, then from there you get to abstract beauty, then you look at beauties of other things that aren't directly connected to the bodies of knowledge, bodies of science, and then you keep going higher till you get the beauty in itself to the form of the good and the truth, right? And juxtapose that with our schema. What we're doing is creating a bar of resistance, right? We're creating a bar of resistance by climbing up in an imaginary way and getting hooked on some kind of fetish object that leaves the unconscious here, das es, split off from us, unable to be articulated by the symbolic, right? The big other, because we're stuck on this imaginary axis. What's Lacan say? Is Lacan going to support what I say? Let's have a look what he says here in Seminar 7. Well now, the step taken by Freud at the level of the pleasure principle is to show us that there is no sovereign good. So for those secretly harboring some kind of a reunion between Lacan and Plato, here it is. There is no sovereign good. Sovereign good is the most important concept in Plato, right? The form of the good, the idea of ideas. There is no sovereign good, says Lacan. The next line, which is das Ding, the thing, right? Which is the mother. So how is the sovereign good connected to the mother, which is also the object of incest, is a forbidden good, and there is no other good. Such is the foundation of the moral law as turned on its head by Freud. So if we put the thing here, which is initially connected to the mother's body or a child's relation to the mother's body, right? Orally and anally, through birth, beforehand. As one creates separation, one chooses a kind of replacement object. If it's a separation based on the loss of the maternal phallus, okay, then you've got the imaginary phallus there. If it's just some other like residue, it's object A. Object A is a more general fetish object in Lacan of seminars 6, 7, and 8. But we might think that's connected to the sovereign good, right? For example, Alcibiades thinks he sees the agalma in Socrates, and he says to Socrates, look, if you give me I know I can see the agalma, I can see the good in you, the moral good that you're always talking about. If you give it to me, I'll trade you the beauties of my body. And Socrates says, even if I did have this good, this sovereign good, this agalma inside me, I wouldn't give it to you because that would be to trade brass for gold. So that's part of Socrates saying the body is rubbish compared to this sovereign good, which I don't have anyway. You've got to look to your soul, right? So there's a sort of maybe something psychoanalytic in that, but also maybe to do with a Christian confessional to come too, right? Look to your soul and confess your sin, young Alcibiades, right? But this sovereign good, not only does Socrates not have it, it's just some kind of like reaction against the thing, some kind of fetish object which stands in place of the maternal thing. See, what we sometimes think is that we can sort of apply Christian-Platonism to this L schema and say, okay, top left, there's the maternal body related to nature, right? Desire. And we've got to get to the symbolic good, the name of the Father, the sovereign good, down here on the bottom right, and avoid the imaginary desire for material objects and stuff. But I think that's a Platonic distortion of Christian-Platonic distortion of the L schema. And I think is as evident in these quotes from Lacan's Seminar 7 that I'm going to talk about. And there are other ways we can view this schema. For example, it's not about escaping the id or escaping the mother as if she's some root of all evil, like some biblical prejudice, to get to the name of the Father, who's this pure, sovereign, pure spirit, to save us. It's about having some kind of proper distantiation, some kind of properly symbolized space, so that when we are playing around in the imaginary, we don't get fixated and think that that's the good. We can take a break and say this can be the time for transgression, this can be the time for taboo, depending on what we're doing, right? This can be Dionysus in the top left, connected to the id. Bottom right can be the Apollonian, right? Form, lucid clarity, reason. So let's have a look at what else Lacan says in Seminar 7. The good as such, something that has been the eternal object of the philosophical quest in the sphere of ethics, the philosopher's stone of all the moralists, this good is radically denied by Freud. This is confirmed in 1,000 different ways, and is, for example, consistent with Freud's central question, which concerns, as you know, the Father. Because what happens to the good in Plato and Socrates is it becomes connected to Zeus, who then eventually becomes connected to the Father and the Christian God. The idea of the good becomes the God of the good, so to speak. And this, Lacan says, is radically denied by Freud. Right? What else does Lacan say? Seminar 7, page 185. Freud's use of the good can be summed up in the notion that it keeps us a long way from our jouissance. So the good is there to keep us separate from the id, where enjoyment is maybe too long away, right? In a way that's no good. It's no good to be too good in this way. As long as it is a question of the good, says Lacan, there's no problem. Saint Martin shares his cloak. He's commenting on a famous story from the Bible. Saint Martin shares his cloak, and a great deal is made of it, for the beggar is naked. Saint Martin gave his cloak to a beggar, right? The beggar is naked, but perhaps over and above that need to be clothed, the beggar was begging for something else, namely that Saint Martin either kill him or fuck him. Very strange comments. What's Lacan trying to say there? That we have this sort of, idealized notion of certain events where the reality of the drive can still be there, acting in a base kind of way. Why would a beggar, or why would somebody who's naked not be out for something else as well? It's possible. That's what Lacan's doing. He's trying to reinscribe perversion. That's very, very Bottelian, like Bataille's notion of base materialism. There's a few instances in the ethics seminar where Lacan does this, when he talks about, one of the Saint Teresa or somebody who drank the water of the leper's feet that she washed to show how self-sacrificial she was. And Lacan's saying, well, maybe she was getting off on it in a perverse way. What if instead she ate the cum of a rugby forward? Or what if it was, of something else from a beautiful young girl? So Lacan's trying to sort of reinstall the real in all these kind of idealized notions of morality, idealized notions of the good that come handed down to us, to say that this good doesn't exist. It's a defense. What's behind the defense? We need to know. Not so we can become perverse, but so we can acknowledge the perversion that we already are, and maybe do something different with it. Why is he doing this? This is Seminar 7, page 216. I will try to discuss the point of view not only of the progress of thought, but also of the evolution of history, which is what we've been doing here in a way, right? Discussing the evolution of history, in order to demystify the Platonic and the Aristotelian view of the good, indeed of the supreme good, and to situate it on the level of the economy of goods. So what he's saying is that this religious notion or theological notion of the good, this transcendental notion that comes to us from Plato and Aristotle, Originally, when we construct the good, it's about practical concerns, right? What do we need? How are we going to distribute a resource? How are we going to accumulate it? What kind of society do we need? Fair distribution of resources, the proper business of politics. It's not this preordained, the good is pure spirit and the rest is like, crime and sin. This is what he's trying to demystify. From the origin of moral philosophy, says Lacan, all meditation on man's good has taken place as a function of the index of pleasure. And I mean all. Since Plato, certainly since Aristotle, who might claim that the good is the highest pleasure of all, the most civilized pleasure, and down through the Stoics. Now, they're Epicureans. Okay, they're Epicureans, you might say. They are the founders of what's known as ethical hedonism. The Stoics, they're all about self-renunciation. So how is that linked to pleasure? It's because they think they're going to deny base pleasure to get to the high pleasure, right? Even through Christian thought itself in Thomas Aquinas. Now, how can Christian thought be about pleasure? It's just deferred. It's like if you spend your life renouncing earthly pleasures, you get to go to heaven, which is pure eternal bliss. The bliss of living without a body altogether, right? If you don't, you go to hell, right? Pain is the absence of pleasure. And this is why Lacan tells us to say that the sovereign good doesn't exist. The sovereign good is the thing which is the mother, to say that the way we're circling around this object, the good, is just a sort of some kind of projection of the way we circle around the mother's body, the ultimate or the origin of pleasure, which we can never really attain because it's a criminal pleasure. Now, what is wrong with this good? All right, I've been following Seminar 7 here, page 96, 185, 186, 216, 221, 230. What's wrong with his good? The sphere of the good, says Lacan, erects a strong wall across the path of our desire. It is, in fact, at every moment and always the first barrier that we have to deal with. How can we conceive crossing over it? That is a problem I will take up next time, when I point out that a radical repudiation of a certain ideal of the good, it's just a certain ideal, it's not saying have no values at all, right? It's a repudiation of a certain ideal of the good is necessary if one is to grasp the direction in which our experience is leading. So often you'll talk about this notion of the good. It's a barrier because we tend to use it as an alibi. So what were you thinking in this and that moment? Oh, I was purely, totally innocent. I was just like Jesus, I was so pure. But this other person did this and the other person did that. And it's like, okay. It wasn't me, Your Honor. I was with the good, right? And this is a kind of barrier that Lacan is talking about here that can be a problem in more ways than one. And he even makes some almost apocalyptic statements where he says, as we wait, what is the point on which this world of the good turns? As we wait for it to drag us towards our destruction, this question has a certain pertinence that you would do well to remember. Now, all these quotes I've plucked from what is chapter 1 of the 2014 book, and that is also in your Lacan Google Drive. The chapter is called Deflationary Ontology of Lacan and Nietzsche. So it has a look of the evolution of history and how Lacan uses the real, the symbolic and the imaginary in a deflationary way to criticize this certain notion of the good that is a repressive notion and actually stymies sublimation, which means it doesn't lead to ethical outcomes at all. It leads to symptoms. Whether it's neurotic symptom, crippling myself, or a perverse symptom, acting something else, but it doesn't matter. There's something like not optimal taking place there that Lacan wants to try and circumvent. Now, how are we going for time? 8:25. Okay. Maybe I will stop it there. I could go on a little bit more, but I want to hand over to questions. Yeah. I think I basically made all these points. This is just from last week, the Sun Temple of Karnak in India, where you have a non-Western example of how eroticism was part of sacred time, right? What's Bataille say in eroticism? We must not forget that outside of Christianity, The religious and sacred nature of eroticism is shown in the full light of day. Sacredness dominating shame. The temples of India still abound in erotic pictures carved in stone, in which eroticism is seen for what it is, fundamentally divine. Numerous Indian temples solemnly remind us of the obscenity buried deep in our hearts, except they wouldn't have seen it as obscenity. We do, because we grew up in this tradition. If you look at the cover of some of the editions of Bataille's eroticism, we have the sort of, the kind of nun figure who's experiencing the thrust of God. His sword of the good came into me and I felt, this blessedness. It's like everything is veiled, but the obscenity beneath that, we know that thrust is a phallus, but she doesn't, even though there's no doubt she comes, as Lacan puts it in Seminar 20, and neither do we if we're pre-psychoanalytically informed when we're seeing these images and valorizing them as we make our way through the world. Now, have a look at what Bataille says in the foreword of this eroticism book from 1957, 2 years before the ethics seminar started. So you wonder how much transfer of knowledge there was between them, maybe via a certain Sylvia, his turn to pick up the kids, a couple of words exchanged. What are you working on? What are you working on? Who knows, right? This is what Bataille says in the foreword. May I also say how touched I have been by the earnest and active support of a great many friends who undertook in the same way to find relevant documents for me. In this context, I should like to mention Boissard, Doussat, Frankel, Fouché, apologies for the pronunciation, and look who's there, Jacques Lacan, right? As well as André Masson, who was brother-in-law to them both, because he married the other Sylvia Bataille's sister. So Lacan gets a mention there, and in the book you have, it's coming from the Jacques Lacan collection, see down there in the bottom left, a statuette that was in Lacan's personal collection that he must have been allowed to be photographed to put in. Temple prostitute of Alexandria, Roman period, clearly showing the female sex. There's nothing to, it's nothing to see. It's something, we can't symbolize this. This is, so far outside the norm. It's there. It's part of a sacred tradition. It's part of religion, right? As is sex work itself. We have a lot of issues trying to handle the idea of prostitution, but prostitution was sacred in these traditions. Now, when we're talking about these traditions, remember the Delphic maxim, nothing in excess, right? We then again, and also remember that while this is the Temple of Delphi, where these maxims of nothing in excess and know thyself were seen as Apollo's domain, as it was, as Roberto Colasso and Erwin Rohde point out, Dionysus was equally important to Apollo, important to Delphi. When Apollo enacted his naughty quest amongst the Hyperboreans of the north, right? And Colasso citing Plutarch with this, saying Dionysus was just as important in Delphi as Apollo. And at Nietzsche, that's what Nietzsche's saying, that this is what stopped Dionysus from becoming barbarian. This is what stopped the Dionysian element from becoming savage and brutal or criminal or sadistic. And Erwin Rohde, corroborates this. He says, when Dionysus is finally introduced to Athens by the Delphic oracle, it is as already reconciled with Apollo, making him thus gentler and more civilized, pruned and moderated, whereupon he would go on to find a wider ranging influence in all Greece. So I think that's much closer to the psychoanalytic ethics of nothing in excess, know thyself, but that includes moderation itself. There's also times where Apollo and Dionysus have to work together. It's a different kind of good, if you like, different kind of common good, not one based on this dualist prejudice where the good has to be pure spirit and the earth and the body has to be something fallen from that, undeifiable, which extracts our sexuality from the sacred and makes it seem something derisory, something contemptuous, where it continues to operate out of us nonetheless. So, okay, I'll leave it there and see how you're all going. So who is everyone? How did everyone find out? Thoughts, comments? Questions? Bill's got a hand up. Is there other people in the chat who were in beforehand, or?
No, that's Bill. Go ahead. Yep.
Thanks, Eugenie, and thanks, Tim. Again, another global overview. Just wanted to make a comment to you. I love this whole what if scenario you pose. You know, what if Christianity hadn't triumphed? And there's a television series that addresses that. That's called Raised by Wolves. And it's set in the distant future, and it imagines an alternative history in which Christianity did not triumph, but there was another mystery cult from the East that did, Mithraism. And it fast forwards thousands of years into the future. Everyone's in space, but guess what? There's a battle going on between a kind of rational secular humanism that's profoundly atheistic and jihadi warriors who are fundamentally Mithraic. So there's a kind of eternal recurrence. You know, you think you repress one belief system, another one springs up. So, but I guess my question goes to, and I'm not sure, I'm getting lost in the argument a bit between, and I'm not sure if it's Bataille or Nietzsche or Lacan, but there seems to be strong gestures here about reclaiming transgression and resacralizing it. And I'm just wondering where that leaves us with prohibition, whether that's demonized or whether that whole sort of sacred demonic is a binary we want to avoid. And if it is, does that in a sense render psychoanalysis irrelevant? You know, if there's no prohibition, or if the prohibition is the wrong way to go. And I guess a further question on from that is, if nonetheless the law prevails, you know, can the law do without the good? So those are...
Yeah, well, the law can certainly do without a certain notion of the good, the one that we've inherited from Christian-Platonism. But it's not as if there's no law at all. It's not as if there's no taboo at all. There's always going to be...
That's the law that we have, you know, in a sense. That's the law that we have.
As you would know better than me. But, you know, there's always those two traditions, you know, competing for supremacy within the West. You know, there's what Nietzsche called Athens versus Judea. Mm-hmm. You know, the Athens is like the democratic, philosophical, creative, and the Judaic is the sort of theological. But you also see that creeping into the Hellenic tradition, which is how the two came together, and we have this sort of mash. But psychoanalysis does not become irrelevant at all, because transgression doesn't have to be literally sacralized in that we have to become literally religious again. Like, these are metaphors, right? These are metaphors for the drives. So when you go to psychoanalysis, it's not because you think Zeus is going to appear or Hera, but you know, whatever myths we're reading or whatever stories we're telling, there's a structure in psychoanalysis which enables us to remember, repeat, and work through these sort of mythical kind of or these imaginary manifestations. And it's not as if the psychoanalysis is not full of taboos and prohibitions. There's tons. You know, it's called psychoanalytic technique, right? Ethics is not the ethics of psychoanalysis is not prohibition free. It's just against a certain notion of prohibition that comes from a certain ideal of the good that we inherited from Christian-Platonism. And you can see how it does this by saying repression doesn't get us very far. You know, as Freud says in his Resistances to Psychoanalysis paper, like, I think it's high time we replace repression with a more secure procedure. You know, or he says, you know, like, we can't sublimate our drives as long as they are repressed, because he had physicians, there's a Boston physician, I think, complaining to him that I can't get my patients to sublimate themselves to the highest ideal. And Freud, like, without missing a beat, is like, you know, a drive cannot be sublimated as long as it is repressed. So we have to fine tune those ideals, right? What are those ideals saying? No to desire that drives the body, but their manner of doing no is too extreme. And it comes from a certain ideal of the good that gets inherited from the Christian-Platonic tradition. So when we say, like, let's have a look at what the pre-Platonic myths were doing, we're saying that there you sort of have an ethics of jouissance that enables us more access or more access, as in like mindfulness of them. We learn a little bit more about the true pole of desire. That's the whole point of a tragedy, and also gives us some vicarious release from them. Like when we watch certain movies today, we empathize with the protagonist and go along with them, right? We don't like walk out the cinema room and then do those things in real life necessarily, but still it opens up possibilities for us that we might not have thought were otherwise there, by getting us to sort of not fess up to them, because they're not seen as like something so derisory. Sexuality was once part of the sacred. So, and you know, there were atheists in the pre-Platonic tradition too.
I get your whole
Yep.
point about editing content and shifting from God to the gods, or and metaphorizing, etc. I guess my question is more structural. Do we need prohibition?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yes. Let me just put in one word then.
Good.
Of course, but which ones? How much prohibition? How do we articulate them? What is being prohibited?
Of course. And as a lawyer, I know those are all sorts of questions, but the key thing is first, it's not transgression, it's prohibition that we're really talking about. That's where we're on the side of the law.
Yeah, I think if we take the historical perspective, when you say we, if you mean the judicial tradition, maybe, but talking from a more of a...
Why not extend that to the civilized tradition or whatever?
Okay, that's
Western tradition.
Because we've got to remember that what a certain notion of the good did, or a certain notion of the law did, was prohibit transgression itself. Mm-hmm. So if we want to emphasize transgression, it's because we're trying to reverse the de-emphasizing of it.
Thank you.
No worries. Sandra?
Hello, thank you. Well, yeah, I was thinking about the what Bill says too. It's not that much of, I mean, because it's not like black and white. Is it that we should just all be like transgressive? It's just like we have to put a little bit of more weight into one side and the other. It's like nothing in excess means that there will be times when there is excess, right? And we have to find a way of like analyze that and figure out how to put it into symbolize it, right? Pass it through the symbolic. But what I was wanting to comment on is because what I'm working on right now is on Bataille's concept of silence, but in his treatise of the inner experience. So he speaks of this like moment when the self is detached from all discourse, right? And this comes through various methods, like precisely the ecstasies within saints. So also in Christianity, we still have some kind of like examples of where we go beyond, and this is related in a way. Well, it's transgression, but it's not. So, but my question was, how could this, if there is any way that we can relate this silence to the original non-relation, or to the there is no sexual relation, or no relationship, like there is no original with the object. And also just very quickly, because this if this returns us to I mean, if silence is part of an erotic process, and this was also and this regards to transgression and the gods being like also there was also an animality within the gods. So it's kind of like how is this in any way related to this beyond discourse? And And of course, it will always ask for a law. I don't know, we can't remain in silence all the time, and we will need to speak. And when we speak, it's precisely when it all regains order and comes back to the symbolic, right? Because there is a, like, it's like in the case of the case of Hans and this problem with naming the desire is what generates some kind of like anxiety, and like it comes to, but I don't know, I was wondering how if there could be any relationship with this, with that notion of non-sexual non-relation in Lacanian terms. It is what I was wondering about all of this.
Yeah, interesting thoughts. Bataille's inner experience stuff, his atheological work from during the occupation during the 40s is really interesting. Probably Lacan's Seminar 20 is the one most connected with that, the idea of a feminine jouissance, or a jouissance beyond the phallus. In fact, Lacan says he wrote his écrit from the perspective of feminine jouissance. According to Rudinesco, also, Lacan had some anxiety about publishing his work, and with Bataille said, "No, do it, just do it." And that's how the écrit actually came out, as a sort of expression of this feminine jouissance, this jouissance beyond the phallus. Now, the notion of all discourse breaking down, of course, is a very interesting one too, because, for example, like Bataille talks about how the notion of God puts a stop to the flow, even if I define God in a purely negative terms, like as a negative theology, it's still a break. It's still a break to the flow, and he wants the flow to continue. Maybe you can introduce new symbolizations. Yeah, but I think the point of this sort of mystical atheology is or atheology, as he calls it, built on the recognition of the Nietzschean notion that God is dead, is just to have sovereignty even from discourse, to have a sovereignty of the drive, to have a break. Have a sovereignty of the drive that's a break from the symbolic. But experiences can emerge, articulations can emerge that maybe can be articulated and grow the symbolic in certain ways, but that's not the predetermined aim of going there. Just like when we go and have an erotic experience with a partner, our aim is not to add to the findings of psychoanalysis. That's not the time to do that. It's time for the drives when we do that. Of course, it's within a frame, still within a symbolic structure to enable that space for that whole to emerge, but it's not the predetermined goal. The eroticism or the sacred time is basically that which is not pre-constrained to a utilitarian goal, even though it may have useful effects as a longer term consequence. I hope that speaks to some of your thoughts.
Thank you.
Yes, Judith? Mute.
You got to unmute, Judith.
Yep, I think I have now.
You have.
I have. I'm sorry, I have a problem with that. Thank you, Tim. It's been really fascinating lecture, talk. I just have a question, which is probably really basic, but you could write a book on it. You said that early on that you were talking about Freud, and you said an instinct of mastery, also a vicarious release for the drives and desire. And I always get really confused about drives and desire, whether desire is a term that means all the drives, or whether how do you see desire as different, or is it the same as the drives?
Yeah, good question. I think it's context dependent. Like, what is the desire for? If it's a desire for the good, then it's going to be pretty distant from the drives, at least at a conscious level. But if it's a desire for an erotic sexual act, then it's one that might be pretty close to the drives. There might be an oral component, an anal component, mixed in with the genital component, a scopophilic component, a voyeuristic component, exhibitionistic component, etc., etc. So there's a sense where desire is a configuration of the drives, the partial drives in their confluence in the genital drive. But then there's the Seminar 11 sort of schema where Lacan, and this is what some of the Slovenian school Lacanians sort of focus on, where desire becomes linked to fantasy as a defensive fantasy against the real of enjoyment. So we get a sort of splitting between desire linked to fantasy and the drives linked to enjoyment and the real. So that's just the schema that like Lacan tried in Seminar 11, just like in Seminar 17, he tried the 4 discourses. If you think it's a useful tool, use it, if you know, but it's not necessarily the whole Uber, and you might not find it that helpful all the time. But I just think it depends on what the fantasy is or what the desire is.
So can I just ask then, if you're talking about a fetish, say someone has, a sock fetish, I mean, is that a fantasy? Is that a drive? Or if someone has, say, a fetish for brown eyes or something, I mean, do fetishes come into, is the drive applicable to the fetish object, sort of?
Yeah, I think so. I think the fetish seems pretty connected to the drive, like prima facie. Yeah, because there's the partial drives and the part objects. I've heard some describe it. It's probably punkish to say that the fantasy is the stage from which desire for the fetish object can play out. So the fantasy might be everything around the kind of desire to get this sock, which may be completely related to something fetishistic connected to the maternal phallus. So it might be quite genital, or it might be the image of it in a certain way. So it might be scopic. Who knows what else the fetish is going to do with a sock once they put it in their pocket and run off with it.
Thank you. Great.
No worries.
Thank you.
If anyone's thinking of taking up a sock fetish, that's what you do. Tim just told us. Put it in your pocket and run off with it.
Well, you can take it off and wave it around because we're on Zoom, so no one's going to smell it one way or the other.
Oh, it's got to be a secret. It's got to be a secret.
What about martyrism in the ideal? I mean, isn't that related to some kind of sadomasochistic drive in the sense, being whipped?
Did you say what about mastery in the ideal?
No. To be a martyr.
Oh, martyr. Yeah.
Yeah, like for law, the football player. I mean, he knew he was, with his bigotry on social media and so forth. And there was a lot of aggressivity with his statement on social media in saying that you homosexuals will go to hell and so forth like that. And here he was knowing full well that he may be penalised for saying such a thing when he's already been ticked off. I mean, there's something, there's a kind of a masochist type will there, to be punished for what he was doing, but at the same time going for that ideal, and yet that ideal of the good, the supreme good, what he considered it to be. There's just a real contradiction there.
This is Israel Folau.
Yeah, that's
the Australian rugby player. Yeah, it's almost like he's making himself a kind of almost like a Jesus figure. He's going to suffer all the indignities of all these people who aren't going to accede to his normativity, and so there might be a masochistic jouissance, but also this deferred pleasure where he feels that he's being going to be looked down favorably upon by the God of the good.
The God of the good. Would that God of the good be something back to the mother, the imaginary symbolic in that context?
Yeah, no, good get. Yeah, because that's what happens with that's what Lacan says about little Hans. He's pushed towards sort of sainthood in being this sort of fetish phallus object for the mother that doesn't involve his penile function, and this could also be done by pushing somebody away from their own homoerotic drives.
Well, that's the other thing too. Yeah.
In their own mind.
Mm.
But we really know that a certain ideal of the good, including how this one's applied in this case, is not good for the human psyche. It's not good for the ones promoting it, and it's certainly not good for the people it's being imposed on. It's a repressive ideal, and it's a really clear example of how certain notions of the good can overdo prohibition. Yeah, and the metaphors of ancient Greece enabled us to actually experience some homoerotic drives in a deified way. The gods and the goddesses had homoerotic episodes all the time, and so thus did the people. There's a Sapphic tradition, and then there's the whole symposium tradition. Like man-boy love and woman-girl love, I imagine, was also common to a certain extent.
Yeah, just thinking of that, I mean, what about Socrates himself in the Apology? I mean, the way he carried on. I mean, he was more or less let off, about, corrupting the young and, making them or worshipping false gods. I mean, he was found guilty, just found guilty and so forth, but he made a mockery of the court when he was fined a certain amount of money, which Plato could have paid for it, the young Plato, because I think his father was a shoemaker and made a lot of money, but no, he just turned around and said, no, you should pay for me. I should be a guest to all your houses, because I've got something to offer here. And of course, it led to the death penalty. I mean, there was a bit of martyrism involved there too.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think there's
deliberately.
Jonathan Lear, I think, says that Socrates is Plato's murdered father function, just like Jesus is for Paul. And we've got these sort of two central martyrdoms, or dead fathers. They come back more powerful in death than they were in life. Both of them martyring themselves, but in different ways. Like, for example, Nietzsche says that Socrates wanted to die because his fundamental pessimism or nihilism was coming out when he says his final words at the Phaedo, "Send the cock to Asclepius because I'm cured," as if life was the ailment and death was the cure, and now he's going to go to a better place. Although he sometimes, disputes, it's disputed how much he believed in the afterlife. But
well, that's the other thing too. I mean, you've got a Plato Socrates, and then you've got Socrates himself in some sense. Maybe he just thought, well, it's time to go anyway,
Yeah.
He was getting on.
Yeah, maybe he didn't know where he was going to go, but he just thought, I don't want to live anymore anyway. Because, well, that's the thing. If we take away affirmation of our drives, then it's pretty hard to still be motivated to go on living, to live for so long in such a repressed state. Like, how satisfying is your son's going to be when it sort of denies so much of your own drives and instincts? I think it creates a real motivational deficit. And so this is what Nietzsche says in his Problem of Socrates chapter at the start of Twilight of the Idols. Socrates is saying, Socrates was a long time sick. Socrates was a long time suffering. Death is the cure. For Socrates, Socrates' life was the disease. So he's saying there's a fundamental pessimism in Socrates, which Nietzsche is suggesting is at the roots of Western nihilism. We don't really like life. That's why we want to kill the planet. That's why we're not doing anything about climate change. We hate nature. We hate it. We'd rather destroy it and get off on the bonfire of the apocalypse. That's this sort of, and Lacan's playing to that too in Seminar 1. Yeah, Western moralism dragging us down the path towards destruction. Why would we want to live if we hate ourselves? If we can't even own up to ourselves, if we can't find any outlet for them, enjoyment of them. So that's the fundamental problem of Western metaphysics.
On that cheery note, we're getting close to the end. Final questions or not? I did have one. But yeah, go on.
Nothing. Just reminded me of that. The anecdote in The Birth of Tragedy, where it's this tale of how King Midas was searching for the fawn and asks him, what is most desirable for men, and Lacan says, well, he kind of like says it in a pejorative way, like despising a little bit of humanity, and says, well, why do you want to force me to say what it's best for, what it would be better for you to not know? And that is that the most desirable thing is not to have been born, and then the second most desirable thing is to die soon. And that is still like I don't know, a question of but I think, I don't know, I mean, you're gonna die anyway, but I don't know why it would be like the most. I mean, I understand it, and it reminded me of all this. I mean, how is.
Yeah, so Nietzsche thinks basically Socrates was this sort of version of Silenus's wisdom. Mi fine, as Lacan says, the final words of Oedipus. Best thing is to die. Best is never to have been born, or at least to die soon. But if you take it out of Socrates' mouth and put it in Oedipus's mouth, you're at a festival of Dionysus. It's pretty spectacular festival. You know, it's a perspective within this greater sort of sphere of affirmation, the beauty of the words, the colors, the art, the rituals, the wine, the celebration. So it's okay to acknowledge our pessimistic tendencies, but we don't want to make it into a sovereign good, and that's what the problem is. Yeah. So the Silenus's wisdom becomes a kind of clandestine kind of a destiny of the good. Can't wait to die so that we can go to heaven, because this life sucks and heaven's going to be better, rather than after death comes nothing hoped for nor imagined, as Heraclitus puts it.
Yeah, just on that, I was just watching the video or something of the 1972 when Lacan was talking about death, and you know that he was more or less suggesting, well, you know, what if I don't want to live to 150? You know, I mean, you know, because life is miserable. You know, it can be unbearable. You want to really put it to an end. I just found that rather intriguing when he was saying that. You know, there's kind of like the death drive there in one sense, in the most literal sense.
Maybe, but we've got to factor in that we're living in this modern world, right? And it's like there was a poet I met when I was in Athens as a young pup. He was from Portland, Oregon, but he was dwelling in Athens, and he said, it's not age I don't like, it's just the effects that I hate. And he was like, he had to have a tooth replaced, and he had his, like, you know, hip that need replacement, and you'd walk down the steps, and it's like, you know, eventually you think, oh God, you know, how much am I going to put up with all these ailments? But you don't blame life itself. You just say, I've come to my time. Like, it's time for me to die my beautiful death, my death at the right time, which was, for example, the Spartan logic too, rather than curse and calumniate the drives and nature and life. Boo-hoo me. It's like, enjoy your time while you have it. You know, choose a nice final chapter and conclusion, and nice bookends, and enjoy the ride in between.
Yeah, also, yeah, just one thing. What I found fascinating is Lacan was saying it's a faith. You have a faith for death. It's not that you know you will die. That's what. But I mean, that was sort of like the subtitles were saying in the translations of the 1972. It's a faith. You have a faith to die rather than knowing, which I found rather strange. I have to have a look at it, but I swear he said that. Yeah,
it's a faith that you die.
Faith, yeah, like believe that you have a faith that you will die. FAITH.
Oh yeah. FATE.
No, not faith, not FATE. No.
It makes him sound religious. I don't know.
Well, whether the subtitles actually capture the interpretation, you know, in English, I don't know. But yeah.
Maybe he's saying we can't be absolutely certain what happens after we die, but I'd say it's still inference to best explanation that nothing much. We live on in the memories of those around us, and that's about it. As this seminar will live on in the memories of those who attended. It's 9:01, so we'll leave it there. But thanks everyone for your participation, and we'll see you next week, which will be the last week before having a 1 week break. Okay. Cheers.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.